Yesterday I got into this article. This is from alchemylab.com, and it's kind of a different view of Saint-Germain than we've seen, and I think it's quite good. A lot of valuable things in it, different perspectives. So I want to continue with that. Yesterday was such a nice day here in Ulaanbaatar, and it was lovely weather and sunny, and I just was feeling good, and was happy to find this article. So I want to continue today. Interesting. If you recall, if you haven't seen it, listen to listen to yesterday's or the previous video, seeming to imply that one of the reasons that people were given to dismiss or disparage our account is one of them was his love of jewels, and I suggested that it was not so much a love of jewels as, first of all, an expert appreciation for them, for their value, yes, but also as an alchemist he had certain talents that were brought to bear on the appreciation of the worth of gems, diamonds, jewels, and also, which of course there's a story that he was able to repair flaws in diamonds, which I have a lot of trouble believing that, but also that it was a store of wealth for him, essential for his survival, because he was kind of itinerant. From what I know, he was a Transylvanian prince, essentially. And he was born into some very difficult political circumstances that I think perhaps required him to be on the move. And this would require that he kept a great deal of his wealth on his person. So perhaps his perceived overindulgence in festooning himself with jewels was misinterpreted. It's called here, his contemporaries did not forgive him for his weakness, and then also his longevity, which I suppose provoked a lot of jealousy. It goes on here. This is great stuff. His lifestyle. Saint-Germain seems to also to have been free personally from the solemnity in which men of religion and philosophers wrap themselves. He enjoyed and sought the company of pretty women of the pretty women of his day. Why wouldn't he? In my view, this is all the more reason to trust him. To wrap oneself, at least in my view, to wrap oneself in the customary solemnity is to admit that you don't really have a very wide or rounded understanding of life, and that you have subscribed to something not created by yourself. It says here, though he never ate any food in public. Okay, that is not correct. He was seen to eat, but he had a kind of very proscribed diet. He was known to eat the white meat of chicken and various brews, teas, and I think some other very light but very, very specific meal that had to be prepared for him. But there were also people who said they never saw him eat. And I think there was that occasion, I think it was with Cagliostro, where he agreed to meet with Cagliostro, but he said on the condition that he would not be expected to dine. So, interesting relationship with food. Undoubtedly, it had some connection with his longevity or being able to remain perpetually at the same age for many, many decades. Though he never ate any food in public, he liked dining out because of the people he met and the conversation he heard. He was also an amazing raconteur, storyteller. He was an aristocrat who lived with princes and even with kings, almost on a footing of an equal. And we read elsewhere that it was not almost as an equal, but it was as an equal, and people were kind of astonished. They didn't expect him to meet and converse and have exchanges with kings and be treated as an equal king by the monarchs of his time. He gave recipes for removing wrinkles and dyeing hair. He had an immense stock of amusing stories with which he regaled society. It appears from the memoirs of Baron von Gleichen that when Saint-Germain was in Paris, he became the lover of Mademoiselle Lambert, daughter of the Chevalier Lambert, who lived in the house in which he lodged. And it appears from Grosley's memoirs that in Holland he became the lover of a woman as rich and mysterious as himself. Of course. At first sight, all this is incompatible with the high mission with which he was invested, with the part he played in the Hermetic societies of Germany and France. Seems incompatible, but we've also, in some of the other readings I've done, I think that these Hermetic societies were not quite as abstemious as many would like to think. And that even this notion that in a developed or sexuality or indulgence in or understanding of through unrestricted enjoyment of it was actually a prerequisite for attaining these states or maintaining a certain kind of energy which would allow one access to those higher frequencies. And then it goes on to say this, but the contradiction is perhaps only apparent. His outward appearance of a man of the world was necessary in the first place for the purposes of the secret diplomacy in which Louis XV often employed him. Certainly. Moreover, we have an erroneous conception of the activities of a master. The possession of an opal of monstrous size, of a white sapphire as big as an egg, of the treasures of Aladdin's lamp, is a harmless pleasure if these treasures have been inherited or have been made through the help of miraculous knowledge. And we know from reading the Isabel Cooper Oakley book that they were most certainly inherited, and that there were provisions made by the Habsburgs to assure that the offspring of Prince Rákóczi would be provided for, I'm sure in exchange perhaps for an agreement not to carry on in the independence-seeking activities of the Prince Rákóczi, but he was given into the guardianship of so-called last of the Medici, who was not at all the last of the Medici, but quite an astounding Medici family. He was the oh my goodness. He was the last prince of Tuscany, who did some quite extraordinary things for his people, who took in Saint-Germain and was responsible for his education. So one could only imagine what kinds of, what an amazing education he probably had. Again, I can only, I can't, the pieces are fitting together, and that seems plausible. At first it didn't, but now I've sort of reconsidered. I think that that was indeed plausible, perhaps probable. Um, it is no great eccentricity in a man to pull down his cuffs in order to show the sparkle of the rubies in his links. And if Mademoiselle Lambert had the ideas of her time on the subject of gallantry, the Comte de St. can hardly be reproached for lingering one night in her room in order to open in her presence the mysterious jewel casket and invite her to choose one of those diamonds that were the admiration of Madame du Pompadour. For pleasure in life drags a man down only when it is carried to excess. It may be that there exists a way by which a man may attain the highest spirituality and yet keep his pleasure. Moreover, on a certain plane, the chain of the senses no longer exists, and kisses cease to burn. A man can no longer harm either himself or others by virtue of the power that the transformation has wrought in him. I would say if as I tend to think, he was perhaps the most extraordinary exponent of freedom and liberty that modern history has seen. And my idea of modern keeps getting older and older, but let's assume that he was the spiritual source, the philosophical source of what I would call the authentic, the genuine revolutionary character of our era. Then I would have to say he would have an innate understanding of what this paragraph alludes to, and would have thought his jewels as nothing more than means through which he might realize or bring into being his vision. Certainly without this independent source of wealth and the kind of amazement which his command over matter through alchemy, or his inexplicable, inexhaustible supply of these diamonds may have provoked, the astonishment with which he astounded or brought out in people through his mere presence at times. These things, I believe, would have to have been understood by him to be simply ways in which he might bring the revolutionary realization, the realization of freedom and liberty into the world. The wealth served him. He did not serve the wealth. And now we move into what's perhaps most compelling, most astounding about him. A man who never dies. A man who knows everything and who never dies, said Voltaire of Le Comte de St. He might have added that he was a man whose origin was unknown and who disappeared without leaving a trace. In vain his contemporaries tried to penetrate the mystery, and in vain the chiefs of police and the ministers of the various countries whose inhabitants he puzzled flattered themselves that they had solved the riddle of his birth. Certainly Isabel Cooper Oakley seems pretty confirmed in her belief that he was indeed the son of Prince Rákóczi. And like I said, his unparalleled, to call it zeal or mission or something doesn't even do it justice. He was not working for he was working for a higher dimension, a higher plane, which demanded everything from him, and from which I think he derived a kind of life force that allowed him to excite vibrations in his environment, which I believe, brought societies into alignment with these higher vibrations. Moving on here. Louis XV must have known who he was, for he extended to him a friendship that aroused the jealousy of his court. He allotted him rooms in the chateau of Chambord. He shut himself up with Saint-Germain and Madame du Pompadour for whole evenings, and the pleasure he derived from his conversation, and the admiration he no doubt felt for the range of his knowledge, cannot explain the consideration, almost the deference, he had for him. Madame du Houssaye says in her memoirs that the king spoke of Saint-Germain as a personage of illustrious birth. Both Charles of Hesse-Kassel, with whom he lived during the last years in which history is able to follow his career, which is implying his so-called death, which many believe was faked, must also, faking one's death is something that I think not such a rare thing. Sometimes it's an absolute necessity to carry on one's mission. Must also have possessed the secret of his birth. He worked at alchemy with him, and Saint-Germain treated him as an equal. It was to him that Saint-Germain entrusted his papers just before his supposed death in 1784. However, neither Louis XV nor the court nor the Count of Hesse-Kassel ever revealed anything about the birth of Saint-Germain. The Count even went so far as invariably to withhold the smallest detail bearing on the life of his mysterious friend. This is a very remarkable fact, since Saint-Germain was an extremely well-known figure. Another astonishing contradiction, someone quite famous, but in many ways utterly mysterious. In those days, when the aristocracy immersed itself in the occult sciences, secret societies, and magic, this man, who was said to possess the elixir of life and to be able to make gold at will, was the subject of interminable talk. An inner force that is irresistibly strong compels men to talk. It makes no difference whether a man is a king or a count. All alike are subjects to this force, and increasingly subject to it in proportion as they spend their time with women. For Louis XV and the Count to have held out against the curiosity of beloved mistresses, we must presume in them either a strength of mind that they certainly did not possess, or else some imperious motive which we cannot determine. I like that phrase, imperious motive, which we cannot determine. It brings to mind kind of the cartoon image of Uncle Sam, and then the connection with Saint-Germain, as that was one of his nicknames, was Uncle Sam. Quite astonishing. But when I think of Uncle Sam in the old cartoons, it's kind of a rangy figure with a kind of almost diabolical, determined face, and then sometimes this kind of wizened benevolence, kind of a combination of the two. This phrase comes to mind. Some imperious motive which we cannot determine. The commonest hypothesis about his birth is that Saint-Germain was the natural son of the widow of Charles II of Spain, and a certain Comte Adanero, whom she knew at Bayonne. I wouldn't agree with this. This isn't the commonest hypothesis. The one that's most accepted is that he was the son of the Transylvanian prince. I'm reading on, the Spanish queen was Marie de Neuburg, whom Victor Hugo took as the heroine of his Ruy Blas. Those who disliked Saint-Germain said that he was son of a Portuguese Jew named Aymar. And while those who hated him said, in the effort to add to his discredit, that he was the son of an Alsatian Jew named Wolf. Fairly recently, a new genealogy of Saint-Germain has been put forward, which seems the most probable of all. It is the work of the theosophists and Annie Besant, who has frequently made the statement that the Comte de St. was one of the sons of Francis Rákóczi II. This is the one that I was to me, this is the one that's the most common, or at least the most accepted. But I've heard of the one that is cited here, but I don't know how widely accepted it is. The children of Francis Rákóczi were brought up by the Emperor of Austria. One of them was withdrawn from his guardianship. The story was put about that he was dead, but actually he was given to the charge of the last descendant of the Medici family who brought him up in Italy. He took the name of Saint-Germain from the little town of San Germano, where he had spent some years during his childhood and where his father had estates. This would give an air of probability to the memories of southern lands and sunny places, which Saint-Germain liked to call up as the setting of his childhood, and it would help to account for the consideration. It would help to account for the consideration that Louis XV showed him. Indeed, the impenetrable silence kept by him and those to whom he entrusted the secret would, in this event, be due to fear of the Emperor of Austria and possible vengeance on his part. The belief that Saint-Germain and the descendants of the Rákóczis are one and the same is firmly held by many people who regard him as a genuine adept and even think he may still be living. Yeah, many people believe that he is living with a secret community under the Himalayas, or in the Himalayas, in some tunnels or underground city. The Comte de St. was a man of, quote, middle height, strongly built, dressed with superb simplicity. As we read elsewhere, he dressed often all in black. He spoke with an entire lack of ceremony to the most highly placed personages and was fully conscious of his superiority. Said Gleichen of the first time he met Saint-Germain, quote, he threw down his hat and sword, sat in an armchair near the fire, and interrupted the conversation by saying to the man who was speaking, you do not know what you are saying. I am the only person who is competent to speak on this subject, and I have exhausted it. It was the same with music, which I gave up when I found I had no more to learn. That's kind of interesting. I haven't read that elsewhere. I like it. Indeed, many people who heard him play the violin said of him that he equaled or even surpassed the greatest virtuosos of the period, and he seems to have justified his remark that he had reached the extreme limit possible in the art of music. Well, I think Paganini would have given him a run for his money, but certainly he was the most extraordinary dilettante of his time, as the aristocracy was not really given to being professional musicians. They could fulfill they could fulfill themselves as musicians as dilettantes, which didn't used to be an insult. Dilettante used to be a compliment. It just meant that you had a great deal of skill and expertise. You just were not a professional for whatever reason. Saint-Germain was also an accomplished artist. One day he took Gleichen to his house and said to him, "I am pleased with you. You have earned my showing you you a few paintings of mine." And he very effectively kept his word, said Gleichen, for the paintings he showed me all bore the stamp of singularity or perfection, which made them more interesting than many of the works of art of the highest order. I should like very much to find out if anybody has these paintings or where they are or where they might be. However, he seems not to have excelled as a poet. There survive of his an indifferent sonnet and letter addressed to Marie Antoinette, quoted by the Comtesse d'Adhémar. It contains predictions in doggerel verse. At the request of Madame de Pompadour, he also wrote a rather poor outline of a comedy. Okay. So that kind of makes the figure of Saint-Germain more believable, more human, right? Not a good poet. Then we're going to get into alchemy. Let me just see how long we've been going on. One sec. Okay, almost a half an hour. Maybe we'll stop it here because the alchemical aspect we've been into before, but I know almost nothing about it, and it's an entire enormous subject on its own. So we'll take a break, and thank you again for coming along on this ride, on this extended meditation on the life of Saint-Germain.